This is Michelle Charters. She's a registered nurse at a convalescent home in Worcester, Massachusetts.
What happened to her?
According to Miss Charters, she was raped. It seems that no one will believe her story.
Why not?
Because she claims to have been raped by an invisible entity.
Hello, and welcome to Discovering the X-Files, the podcast in which a newbie takes a deep dive into the entirety of Chris Carter's universe, while longtime fans escort me on the journey, a perilous journey filled with government conspiracies or weird monsters every other week. I'm Erix Antoine, and today Daniel and I will be discussing Excelsis Dei, which originally aired on December 16th, 1994. It was written by Paul Brown and directed by Steven Surgic. In this episode, Mulder and Scully are investigating a sexual assault claim at a nursing home, where the assailant appears to be a disembodied spirit. It's a Monster of the Week episode which handles some rather heavy topics, not the least of which is the struggle of sexual assault victims to receive the support they need at a time of crisis, in a world that seems unfairly stacked against them. Whether it is entirely successful or not is what Daniel and I will be discussing in a moment. Stick around.
Are you aware that you're being named in a lawsuit against the federal government?
I am.
Did you ever threaten Miss Charters?
Threatened? It was harmless, for crying out loud. Ever since this sex harassment fad, men can't say what's on their minds.
She says you made advances. Advances?
If I told you you were a very pretty woman and I would like to show you some affection, would you be offended, huh?
Okay, so here we are with this very intriguing little episode. A ghost story thriller. A ghost thriller from the director of Wayne's World 2. Which was an interesting... it's the only episode he's directed for the X-Files. I looked it up. He was apparently a fan of the series and lobbied to direct this episode. Something about it must have really spoken to him as a filmmaker. Maybe he had some personal connection to some of the elements in the story, I can imagine, because this touches on some themes, on some issues that I think in one way or another have affected or will affect or could affect anyone at any point. I think we all have some experience with the elderly in our family, and it's a very important issue. And so a lot of films and shows and whatnot have been made that touch on some of these topics to varying degrees of success and impact. If you want to look at this as kind of a horror movie variation on Cocoon, you can. If you want, there are many different things. One thing that I couldn't help but think about when watching this episode, you may or may not immediately understand what I'm getting at. But one thing that popped into my head, one person that popped into my head was Stan Lee.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there are a couple of reasons. The first reason, it's Excelsis Dei, and so, you think of Excelsior, but that has really nothing to do with anything. And then I also thought, towards the end of his life, Stan Lee, there are a couple of things, revolving around him and, him being such a revered figure among geeks. The first was that there were some accusations thrown his way of sexual harassment, thrown his way by, I believe, nurses that were caring for him in his final days, in his final years. So this episode opens with a situation in which a nurse is she is sexually harassed by the elderly man that she's caring for, but she takes it in stride at that moment. Like in the actual moment that that happens, she takes it in stride. And I of course, am not going to in any way suggest that that sort of behavior is acceptable or okay or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that it happens. It happens, and it certainly has happened and continues to happen when you have men of a certain age who grew up at a certain time and that come from a certain time, have a certain level of education, of culture, where in this gentleman's mind, what he was doing in his mind was harmless. In his mind, he was just hitting on her. He was just paying her a compliment. So it doesn't occur to him that this could make her uncomfortable, that this could be inappropriate or anything like that. So it was an interesting thing to consider, because when those accusations were thrown Stanley's way, we of course have no way of knowing if these things were true or not, but they were certainly believable accusations. And many people coming out in his defense would say, "Oh, but come on, for goodness sakes, it's harmless. He's not, he's just an old man. He's a dirty old man, whatever." It sort of makes you think. It makes you ponder the reality of that. The fact that we often do dismiss what can be a very real problem in this way. We say, for goodness sakes, he's just a little old man. What's he going to do? I mean, he's in his last days. Let him have some excitement, for God's sake. That's all, So I thought it was interesting that this episode, which is, about almost 25 years old now, already touched on these themes in a way that I think was very, very potent and very pointed. Like they really were trying to make a comment on this. They go as far as to have this character this nurse then gets sexually assaulted. So they go all the way. They go like, well, yeah, you think it's harmless, and yet, is it really harmless? Because ultimately we're talking about extremes. Ultimately, if it's inappropriate, it's inappropriate. And yeah, if we have to push it to extremes for you to finally say, oh, okay, okay, that's going too far. And then this nurse, obviously no one believes her story. Her feelings are not taken into account, and so on and so forth. And so that was on my mind. It was something that was on my mind. And I was wondering what you thought about that, and if this episode made you think of that, or just what you think of this episode in general. What thoughts went through your mind as you watched it?
I didn't specifically think about Stan Lee, but there's a lot to unpack here from, looking back on it 25 years on or around that. I mean, you've got the sexual harassment angle, which, the character of, I believe his name is Hal, even mentions the fact that it's no longer politically correct for him to make comments like that to women.
Yeah.
And he complains about that and then hits on Scully anyway, and then turns to Mulder and apologizes to him as if, well, obviously you're hitting on her all the time. I'm sorry for taking up your space, which is ridiculous. But,
right.
You've got that whole angle. And then you have you have a Me Too angle here. This woman has been raped. She has been sexually harassed and sexually assaulted. No one wants to believe her. And part of why no one wants to believe her is that she's filed some insurance complaints in the past. So they just want to use those incidents. And we never really go into what happened with those. But they want to use those as an excuse to ignore her here, even though something clearly happened to her. They're just wanting to brush it off to the side. And, I'm sure they're probably hoping she'd just quit her job and move on and they'd not have to deal with her anymore. But, yeah, there's a lot of things we talk about all the time today at play in this episode, which is really interesting.
And exactly, when Hal is talking about oh, for goodness sakes, nowadays a person can't speak their mind or whatever. It's people are still complaining about that today. And it made me realize that it's not that things have changed. It's that, let's say, the outlets for communication have expanded. So now what Hal is saying Hals all over the world are now able to vent their frustrations on Twitter
Yep.
or on Facebook, or if they're elderly, most likely on Twitter, on Facebook. But in any case, that is the sort of thing that makes you realize this is not new. None of this is new, like remotely. And if strides have been made, and they certainly have, and we can certainly be thankful that strides have been made, and hopefully will continue to be made in giving people a voice and just starting to break down some of these things. This sort of thing, we're always going to run into this. I don't think it's ever going to go away entirely, because people don't want to change with the times. People don't want to adapt to, as society starts to change and open up to new ideas and realize certain things and figure out ways to fix what's wrong. There are people who are resistant to that because they feel threatened, because they feel like if it threatens their comfort in any way, then it's got to be wrong. It's got to be bad. It's a problem. And so, yeah. And talking about the nurse, I think the character's name is Michelle, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she, right, they don't want to believe her. And of course, to be fair, her story is not immediately easy to believe. Someone tells me that she was, if a woman, as much as I want to believe, a victim, and as much as I would want to, if they come to me and they say I was sexually assaulted by an invisible man, I would be like, well, I'm sure it wasn't an invisible man, but let's try to investigate and see what actually happened. But in any case, I would need more, right, before I can entirely help her in any way. So I would assume she's mentally disturbed. But the point is, on top of her story, which seems far-fetched, she does have physical evidence that she's been assaulted. And so it begs the question, and I think even Scully brings it up at one point. It's like, what? I mean, so she concocted the story. She's faking it. She's trying to get out of the job or sue or get some money. But look at all those injuries. I mean, how can she really fake all of that? I don't think so. So that's the part where even with physical evidence that something went wrong, they do not want to help her. They don't want to look into her story, because the natural assumption would be to think, okay, well, clearly she was sexually assaulted, and clearly by someone in this hospital. Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, she is not telling us who did it, and invented some crazy story, maybe because she's very scared. I mean, I would think many things, but I wouldn't discount the idea that she definitely was assaulted. And now it's just a question of investigating and getting to the bottom of to find out who's the culprit and resolve the situation fairly. But the thing is that it is interesting that they go into that and they pull out, yes, she clearly was unhappy in her job and was trying to get out of it, first with insurance claims and this and that, and yeah, so they use that as an excuse. Oh, it's just her up to her old tricks. Since the other stuff was dismissed, she figured she'd go all the way and just start suing us because she was violated by one of the patients or whatever. So it is food for thought. It definitely is. So on that aspect, you have that. So it touches on that. And something else where it was brought to mind, Stanley, they do touch a little bit on the concept of elder abuse.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that the elderly are put in these places where they are supposed to be cared for. And the fact is that they are being cared for by strangers at that point. And, not everyone is good. Not everyone is a nice person. Not everyone has the patience. Not everyone really cares. And so they are psychologically, sometimes physically abused by orderlies and doctors and the other people at these facilities. And so you kind of see a little bit of that too. That stuff is very, I think, very pointed and intriguing. And really, I thought more about that than anything in the episode itself. Even though the episode in of itself is entertaining and suspenseful and it has some interesting ideas. It's Haunted Hospice. A good title for it if it were a movie, Haunted Hospice. The thing about it is that there is a central problem with the story. and see if you follow. It's a common X-Files problem at this point, where we have sort of a half-baked idea
Yeah.
that is not quite explained, because you have, on the one hand, you have the idea of the nurse being sexually assaulted by an entity. You have the orderlies that are murdered, presumably by an entity, whether they're thrown out a window or whatever. And the implication is that it is either Hal or Stan or someone else somehow able to project themselves psychically and enact and do what they want to do through a psychic projection. That's the implication, because
Yeah.
that's certainly what she thinks. She believes that it is Hal that somehow managed to project himself psychically and rape her. And because she even says, when you're around people, they smell a certain way, this and that, etc. So that's the implication, but I'm not sure if that's what actually happened. Like, hang on, because you have that, and then you have the other thing, which is Sab Shimono, who's giving them shrooms. You have the doctor who thinks it's his treatment that's helping them with their Alzheimer's, but no, it turns out that it's Sab Shimono shrooms, and that's what's really curing them and making them more lucid and alert and whatever
Yeah.
else. And you think that those things are related, but the episode, you're not sure. That's the thing. So you were about to say something before I go ahead.
No, this is the kind of thing where if this were Poltergeist 4, Zelda Rubinstein would walk in and say, they've been taking these pills, it's been amplifying latent psychic abilities in these patients, and the psychic charge of them running around the hospital while they're sleeping has awakened all the other spirits in the building. That's sort of the impression I got, that yes, Hal and Stan are doing things. They are, Hal did rape the woman, Stan is killing orderlies. But the impression I got is that that's happening, and then on top of that, everything that they've done with them overdosing on the mushroom pills has awakened all of the angry spirits that reside in the building of, elderly people who have passed in horrible or depressing manners. And those spirits are now lashing out as well, I guess, feeding off of that energy and using it to physically interact with their environments. But we don't have Tangina. We don't have Zelda Rubinstein here. So what instead we get is Mulder going, I don't know how it's happening. It's because of these pills. I don't know how they're doing it, but it's happening. We need to stop this.
Yeah, yeah. See, and that's the thing. I don't know how. It's
Yeah.
because of this, but I don't know how. And you, my dear viewer, who are sitting there watching this, just have to kind of sit there and swallow this pill, just
Yes,
like we're
literally.
being asked to. And that's it. Like, you're not even. It's like, okay, fine. I guess somehow it has something to do with it. And again, that's not enough for me. Like, you've got to make that connection, man. To make the story really be satisfying, you've got to make that connection, because it's got to be one or the other. I really don't think you can have it both ways. And if you have it both ways, you have to make a very explicit connection. Because the idea of that these mushrooms somehow give these elderly people, apart from curing their Alzheimer's, also gives them the ability to. It's not only a mind altering thing, or a mind clearing thing. It's also a mind expanding thing that actually grants you abilities. Opens up the possibility of you being able to project and use your mind in ways that you never thought possible. And that would make perfect sense. And for like half the episode, that's what you think is happening, and that makes sense. So I don't understand why they feel the need to stick this other element in there.
Yeah, it's one step too far, because you can see the connective tissue, because it all stops once they sedate Stan at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, no one ever steps forward. I mean, if you'd had what's the orderly's name again?
God, I don't remember. They both. I don't remember the name. There's two of them. And do you mean the one that goes out the window?
No, the one who's making the pills.
Well, I mean, the actor's name is Sab Shimono,
Yeah.
so let's just call
Probably
him that.
he would have been the one to give the line or two of dialogue that connects, point A to point B as far as the psychic projections and restless spirits go. But they never quite, they have him go give a little speech about how, in Asia, they revere their elderly and treat them way better than we do here. And, this substance is used to help commune with the spirits of the dead, but it can also ease troubles that elderly minds have, like Alzheimer's or dementia. So you can see the connective tissue just laying there on the table, but no one actually picks it up and puts it together in terms of the dialogue. So it just feels like two completely separate plot arcs that never fully gel because they didn't take the time to explain it. It's fine if Mulder and Scully don't understand it, but we as the audience should understand it a bit more than we actually do.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's a problem that happens because you kind of get it. I mean, Mulder and Scully are supposed to be the audience surrogates in the sense that they take us into this. They're the investigators. We are following this story along, and as they uncover things, so do we. And that is the traditional structure of a detective story, of a mystery story, where the protagonist uncovers the clues and the mystery starts to unravel. And some sharp viewers might be a step or two ahead of the protagonists, but the point is that you're supposed to follow along. But at some point, those connections have to be made.
Yeah.
So if you're left in the dark and they're left in the dark, then it's just like, then you don't know what's going on, and you end up with something that's not entirely satisfying. Now, I think because this episode touches on themes that are so universal and potent, I think it gets away with being a little murky in other terms because you're kind of sucked into the plight of the people at this hospice, at this care facility, and it makes you reflect on society's treatment, particularly Western society, particularly American culture, and the treatment of the elderly. Again, having Sab Shimono talk about his experience. He's Asian, and he's the way they treat the elderly in his country as opposed to how they treat them here. And these are very, very clear, very unsubtle ways of saying to the viewers, here in America, the way we treat our elderly is completely wrong. We should not do things this way. And so because of that, the episode, I think, is extremely compelling, even when it doesn't entirely make sense, right?
Yeah.
And then on top of that, like the climactic moment with Mulder and Michelle in the flooded bathroom, that's some pretty elaborate, well done stuff. That's pretty well done. It was apparently a very complicated shoot.
I bet.
Because it required them to flood like a corridor, and they had to have a water tank and all this stuff, and they did partially shoot on location at some, I guess a care facility in British Columbia, and they shot partially on location and partially in a studio, but that scene is impressive, legitimately impressive.
Yeah, I couldn't remember how that particular sequence ended. I guess in my mind I just assumed that Scully did get the water turned off, but no, what saves them is the fact that the water pressure is so strong it just blows the door off the hinges and they just spill out into the hallway.
Yeah, there is kind of an interesting beat there where Scully, like they're banging on the door and like Mulder's like, all right, go shut off the valve or whatever, right? And she's like, okay, I'm on it. Like she goes to do that. And she sort of starts strutting down the hallway towards the basement or wherever, and she gets stopped. by I think it's Stan's daughter, right? Who's just like,
Yeah.
or like, oh help, I need help here. So she like, okay, she goes in the room very calmly, sort of, okay, well, call so and so and whatever else. And you're like, meanwhile, Mulder and Michelle are like, they're like drowning in the other room. It's like, hurry up, Scully! What the fuck could you have said? No, I don't have time for this. Call a doctor. I gotta go like turn off the valve. But no, like she goes in, she checks him out, and then she continues her journey down to the boiler room or whatever. But I think that was an interesting little beat there. But that's basically in terms of that, like that's basically it. I think that I was so distracted by the episode's themes that I was not able to really focus on it beyond a very superficial level to just be entertained by the story. I do think that on some elements, on some level, because they wasted time with some elements that maybe weren't necessary, having those ghosts, and even making it confusing, because like they imply that mushrooms do give you hallucinations, and they imply, she's like saying you're reading too much Carlos Castaneda, and like, like implying that yeah, shamans who they eat mushrooms or they drink tea and they have hallucinations which they then interpret, and that's and that's no different from what's happening here. And so obviously it puts that little nugget of doubt, like, well, are these ghosts or are these just Dorothy's hallucinations? Because the only person we ever really see communing with the ghosts on that level is Dorothy. And I think that's left deliberately ambiguous. Although there's that one beat where Scully's there surrounded by ghosts and Dorothy's like, you don't get any ideas, mister, you get away from her or whatever, like, right? And
Yeah.
And Scully gets this kind of look on her face where you get the sense that she's starting to feel uncomfortable, like she can feel the presence of those entities surrounding her. And she's just kind of like, yeah, this is kind of creepy. I'm getting out of here.
Dorothy's an interesting aspect of this because I would assume Chris Carter and company cast Frances Day because she's a David Lynch regular. She was in Blue Velvet. She was in the Twin Peaks film. She was on Twin Peaks for an episode. And, I always remember her from In the Mouth of Madness as Mrs. Pickman. But the fun comparison here is that not long after this, she ends up playing Grandma Gilmore in Happy Gilmore, who is put in an abusive retirement home at the mercy of an insane Ben Stiller. So
Yes.
I was thinking about that a lot the entire episode as well.
Yeah, that's a little bit. Yeah, you're right. That's a very good point. Where it took me a minute, but you're right, because of course I remember her from Blue Velvet and from Twin Peaks. It took me a minute though to realize that it is the grandma from Happy Gilmore. But yeah, the touching on that, using her. This predates Happy Gilmore by a couple of years.
Yeah.
I mean, Happy Gilmore touches on that in a satirical way, satirical vein, but it's still trying to sort of point out that this is a real thing. Mm-hmm. Yes, they're doing it with dark humor. Some people might feel that that's inappropriate, whatever, but they are doing it. They are trying to point out something that's real. Yes. And here in the X-Files, they're doing the same thing, again, using a genre construct to get you to think about real things. And I think that that's one of the values of genre TV or genre storytelling in general. The fact that you can take these stories, you can tell these stories that seem to be about one thing, obviously, and on the surface, that's what it is. It's on the surface, this is a haunted retirement home. That's what it is. It's a story about that, and it's just a creepy horror story. But what is it really about, right? And episodes like this really give us a chance to think about that. Maybe that's unsubtle. Maybe that's a little too on the nose in a case like this. But I don't know how else they could have done it. I mean, clearly they wanted to talk about this, and that's why I mentioned at the top the director of Wayne's World 2. Maybe he really connected with the story. Maybe he had an experience with a family member in a retirement home, or he had thoughts about that concept or about doing that with your family members, and he saw through this episode an opportunity to really express some of his feelings about that and create something that could be potent and memorable. And I think that on a general level, he does pull it off. Mm-hmm. I mean, this definitely does give you things to talk about, even as it doesn't really satisfy all the requirements of like a good resolution or anything else. The fact that it gets you thinking about these themes, I think, is important and worth noting.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the coda where Scully's doing her usual narration, because there's a lot going on in that. On the one hand, we find out that Michelle's lawsuit is settled out of court. She obviously, it doesn't undo any of the trauma that she experienced, but she gets some sort of settlement, and then the state takes over the hospital again, and they fire the doctor for some reason, even though he had nothing to do with any of it.
Yeah, that part was weird. I was like,
It's
wait a
kinda
minute, he didn't
messed
do
up.
Yeah, like what? I mean, he didn't do anything wrong. They managed to find evidence that it was those pills, I guess.
Yeah.
That he had nothing to do with. So at most, I guess they just fire him because, like, oh yeah, guess what? Your miracle treatment didn't work for shit. Clearly, you don't know what you're doing, so we're just gonna fire you. I mean, I don't know, like what the thinking was behind that.
Well, and what kills me about that particular element is, we see the administrator a few times throughout. We see the two orderlies along with Michelle, and then you have the doctor, and I really need to see what his name is. It's driving me nuts.
Sab Shimono?
Yes,
Right,
Sab
right.
Shimono's character of Gung. Okay,
Gung.
so between everyone on the staff, the only staff members who actually seem to give a shit about the patients beyond just apathy or outright hostility are Gung and the doctor.
Right, right.
So,
And they're the ones who, in the end, are
get
ultimately
punished. Yeah.
yeah, they have to fall on their swords essentially at the end of it for for the good of the hospital. And you're right, because they also make a big point of how the INS has been contacted.
Yeah,
and
he's getting deported.
yeah, and Gunn will be sent right back to Malaysia. So it's yeah, it's a
Prison,
bit,
okay, but
yeah.
getting deported is a bit excessive. And
Yeah.
then on top of that, after an already depressing line of sentences from Scully, we find out that all of the patients who had been on Gung's miracle drug have completely reverted back to however severe their Alzheimer's and dementia was.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
just no one is happy whatsoever. And then the final button, the Chris Carter hammer on the skull, if you will, even though he didn't write this one, is that we see Stan just looking utterly gutted and depressed and not knowing what's going on, and then he turns and looks straight into the fucking camera before it goes to black. So
Yeah.
it's literally just them giving a giant middle finger and saying, "Fuck you for treating your elderly this way."
Yes, exactly. Like
Created by Chris Carter. And then it's over.
Yep. I mean, that's exactly what I'm saying. I mean, by the end of the episode, I was emotionally involved in the plight of the characters,
Yeah.
more so than the supernatural gobbledygook that's going on. That stuff was just it was the candy coating. But the story itself is so compelling and so heartbreaking, so genuinely heartbreaking. And I think that anybody who has had any experience even remotely close to this would probably be affected by this episode. If you've had a family member or know someone who you've seen go through anything remotely like this, you see these stories and they're sort of like, oh man, yeah, it really sucks. And it continues to suck. The fact that you can watch this thing 25 years later and know that things have not gotten any better in any significant way. Not in strides in medical science to help people with those conditions, and not in the care industry itself to make things better for people who need to live in like hospice care or whatever it is. So I think that independent of the episode having a few flaws, I do think it's noteworthy because those themes remain potent. That sledgehammer that Chris Carter just sort of smashes you on the head with. And yeah, that note, the two people who truly care are the people punished. The miracle drug was actually something that a holistic, if you will,
Yeah.
or homeopathic or whatever they call those things. That natural something. It was something natural. It wasn't something chemical. It was something that would very likely not be approved by the FDA
Yeah.
because Sab Shimono does not have them in his pocket, and Big Pharma has nothing to do with that. Even though that's the drug you should be taking, most likely that is the pill that is going to help you. You should be administering that to your elderly who are suffering from Alzheimer's. That thing's going to go away. Nobody's going to say, "Hey, wait a minute, this actually is a good thing." I mean, they were abusing it, they were taking too much of it, and then things went a bit haywire because of that. But the pill in and of itself, it worked. And this should be investigated. This should be looked at. Nobody gives a shit. They're deporting the doctor, they're firing the other doctor, and just moving on, and things are going to continue to be exactly the same as they were. So, it's tragic.
Yeah.
Miss Charters, the facts of your case seem to contravene those of other cases we have on file.
Right. You mean the other woman raped by Invisible Man cases?
How do you know it was him who attacked you?
He made advances toward me. And he said things, rude things. Look, when you bathe somebody every day for 5 years, you get to know more about them than you really need to. And an old man smells a certain way, and he feels a certain way.
I know this is hard for you.
No, this is the easy part. Look, I didn't make this up, okay? I was attacked.
And that is that. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. And if you did enjoy it, there are many ways you can support this podcast, which is available on Anchor FM, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. You can subscribe. You can rate and or review it depending on what platform you're enjoying it on. And of course, you can share and spread the word on social media. Please do any or all of these things. Every little bit helps. Look for the Erix Antoine Network on Facebook or on YouTube. You can also follow me on Twitter at ErixAntoineNet and check out my film reviews on Letterboxd. You should also check out Daniel Baldwin's website, theschlocketeer.com, and follow him on Twitter at Daniel W. Baldwin. I'm Erix Antoine, and I'll be back in a couple of days when Daniel and I will be discussing a rather atypical X-Files episode called Aubrey. I hope you'll join us. And until then, please remember that the truth is out there. See you next time.